Hey folks, Robert Pease here with a quick note about premium content from The Purple Principle, available now on Patreon and Apple Podcast subscriptions. If you're already an Apple listener, why not try us out there for 7 days? Subscribers get access to exclusive material like uncut interviews and episode sneak peeks. And if you're looking for more membership options or want to connect with like-minded listeners, head over to patreon.com/Purple Principle Podcast to join us there. A lot goes into making our show, and we really appreciate your support. Links to join Apple subscriptions and Patreon are in the show notes. And now the episode.
We've had entertainment. We've had Silicon Valley, great technology. We've had tourism. We've had agriculture. I mean, this is a state that really has a strong, diverse economy. And if you want California to continue to be a state that grows in the future, you've got to take into consideration a lot of views.
That's likely a familiar voice to many of you, Leon Panetta, a major figure in both the Bill Clinton and Barack Obama administrations. But before the executive branch, Panetta represented a Northern California district in the U.S. Congress for 9 terms. I'm Robert Pease, and this is The Purple Principle, a podcast about the perils of polarization.
And I'm Barbara Bogave. Leon Panetta is one of our 3 very different, but we hope complementary perspectives in this episode. It's our 3rd in our 3-part series on the challenges facing the nation's largest state and my home. Later on, we'll speak with Kristin Olsen, former Republican leader of the state assembly. She took on those challenges by trying to form a new California GOP distinct from the national party.
And we found our number one problem wasn't necessarily the party's position on issues at that time. It was that they didn't like Republicans and didn't want to vote for Republicans because Californians didn't think we liked them.
Also on the show today is Andrew Heaton, self-exiled satirical poet of Los Angeles, now resident in Austin, Texas. Andrew tells us what inspired his book, Los Angeles is Hideous, Poems About an Ugly City.
A funny coffee table book about Los Angeles took me 3 weeks and 60 milligrams of Adderall to write. And it was by far the most popular, successful book I've ever written. Far more popular than novels that take years of blood and sweat to write.
More on that later. Let's start on a very different wavelength with Leon Panetta. He remembers a much more bipartisan spirit in national and California politics. Panetta was first elected to Congress during the U.S. bicentennial year of 1976.
But it was a time when Republicans and Democrats worked together on a number of issues. And as a result, I think really created some landmark legislation with regards to the water projects in California, but also the educational institutions in California. And it worked well. What's happened is that California, like the rest of the country, has become increasingly polarized. I've often said in my public career of over 50 years, I've seen Washington at its best and Washington at its worst. I think you could probably say the same thing for California.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. And I believe you are watching your son, who represents that district, deal with some of those issues.
Well, Jimmy is a really perfect example of somebody who's seen both sides of this equation. He was a young intern really in the State Department, came back and lived with me. At the time, I was living with 3 other members of Congress. And we made a point of going out, having dinner with Republicans who joined us. We would go on trips with Republicans. We played basketball with Republicans. We had a good relationship. And Jimmy saw that, and he saw how that interpreted out into my ability to get things done as a member of Congress.
There is some press, and we think some reputable press, not just, some right-wing talking points about California losing some luster in recent time. It had, a lot of luster for many decades. But recently, there's some concerns about housing prices and taxes and regulations, some major companies leaving.
Here in California, the fact is we really only have one governing party right now. And the Republicans, while they're present in Sacramento, their number is so small that not much attention is paid to the Republicans. And they've become more extreme in their politics, reflecting what's happened to the Republican Party on the national scene. And if you want California to continue to be a state that grows in the future, you've got to take into consideration a lot of views, the views of business, the views of obviously workers, the views of those who have major elements in our economy. I mean, the important thing about California is we've had a diverse economy. That's one of our great strengths because we're a diverse people. Our education system at the K through 8 and high school years is not up to what it should be in a state like California. We're now near the bottom in terms of the quality of education we're providing our children. So the result is that the California dream, which is what I lived as a boy, and I'm the son of immigrants, I had a chance to live that dream, which meant the ability to have a better life. That's a dream that a lot of young people these days are feeling like they're not going to be able to achieve.
Yeah, well, I think there's obviously a lot of intelligent, well-connected people who agree with you and have made efforts to try and create a stronger Republican Party in California. I'm thinking about the New Way effort by Schwarzenegger and others to create a more moderate California GOP with, less connection to the national party. Were you surprised that that effort didn't really go very far?
Yeah, I was. Because I frankly think that, I know a lot of Republicans in the Monterey area. A lot of them are businessmen, a lot of them very, very practical individuals who really want to do the best for their community and for the state. And what I sensed was that, and I thought Schwarzenegger tried to do the right thing, but for some reason they weren't able to build the kind of strong coalition they needed. I mean, the Republicans have to make a basic decision. Do they just want to become the lost party in California and take on the Trump big lie and preach these conspiratorial theories that are crazy and nuts? Or do they want to be able to ultimately get a piece of the action in California and be able to impact on policy in the state? If Republicans are going to do that, they have got to be able to reach out and understand that California is going to be a state in which immigration plays a large role. They're going to have to reach out to minorities. They're going to have to reach out to women. And if they could build that kind of coalition, mark my words, they could represent a power for the future. But if they're just going to stay on the right wing of the country, on the cliffside, and not move, then the Republicans will never be a force in California.
That's former 9-term Northern Californian Congress member Leon Panetta, a lifelong Democrat, bemoaning polarization and one-party governance in the Golden State in recent times. We'll hear his thoughts on future challenges for California in just a moment.
But first, we're going to expand on that discussion of the New Way effort back in 2018. Our former governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, a moderate Republican, endorsed New Way that year when he saw that Trumpian populism had overtaken the national GOP. And it seemed like the California GOP could follow his lead, maybe.
But New Way just did not take off. We wanted to learn how the effort was formed and why it failed to get traction. So he reached out to one of the leaders of that New Way effort, former minority leader of the California State Assembly, Kristin Olsen.
New Way California started, those of us who worked to build it and grow it, started with the premise that a healthy democracy really requires 2 or more robust, healthy political parties, right? As Arthur Brooks often says, we don't need less disagreement, we need better disagreement. We need people from different perspectives, different ideologies, sitting around a table talking about their different opinions on a particular public policy matter so that the ultimate solution is a better solution that serves a greater number of people, right? So that's the premise we went with. And at the same time, the context in California was a deteriorating Republican Party, losing more and more elections statewide and federally, and just an unhealthy dynamic where they didn't have the ability to compete with their ideas in the public policy stage.
Kristin, I'd like to dig into that because at the time that you were thinking about the break and starting New Wave, you said in a press interview that you didn't have the logistical support needed from the party on a project to develop solution-focused leadership and messaging focused on everyday Californians to help expand the GOP's shrinking ranks. So could you unpack that for us and get specific? What was this project and how did you feel unsupported and what did the party take issue with?
Yeah. And, it was sort of a back and forth, whether they were excited about it or supportive of it or not. And ultimately, they weren't. But it started when I was the minority leader, the Republican leader of the California State Assembly, and at the same time was on the California Republican Party board. And we undertook a project to really test, what do voters care about? What is their view of the Republican Party? Because until we know what the problem is, we don't know how to go about fixing it. And we found our number one problem wasn't necessarily the party's position on issues at that time. It was that they didn't like Republicans and didn't want to vote for Republicans because Californians didn't think we liked them. Well, that's a big problem, right? If a voter feels
I would think so.
unliked, right, by an elected official or a candidate, they're not going to give us the time of day to listen to our policy ideas. And so there was this fear on the board that if we changed the status quo in any way, that we were instead abandoning our principles. And it sounds crazy when I repeat it, but it was a really strong dynamic. And so those of us who really wanted to try to continue to push this forward and advance this effort forward did it outside of the party through New Way California in a way that we thought would complement their efforts and built a lot of momentum. As you said, we had Governor Schwarzenegger involved, John Kasich involved, and put on some really good summits. But ultimately, we found we could not overcome an increasingly toxic national Republican brand.
Yeah, well, Kristin, it seems to us that in some ways you were asking people to change political identities, and we know identity is very deep-rooted, not easy to change. We'd like to play a quote from a neuroscientist that we had on the show, Jay Van Bavel, who's a real expert in the nature of political identity. He recently co-authored a book, The Power of Us.
And there's been a couple studies where they have looked at what happens when certain cults predict the end of the world. And they've been able to study, what happens the day that that prediction doesn't come true. What you might expect is that cult members should update their beliefs. They should be like, oh my goodness, this cult was totally wrong. What was I thinking? I've got to rebuild my life and I've got to move. I've got to leave this cult. But that's not what happens. In fact, a couple studies that have gone into these cults and looked at these cult members have found, if anything, the opposite happens. They immediately start to look for rationalizations. And so in that situation, they actually double down on this identity they have with this cult.
But did you bump up against that people who, perhaps on a conscious level, they respected what you're trying to do, but on a deep subconscious level, their identities were just too deeply formed?
Very much so. When we got down into communities talking with everyday voters, everyday people, we didn't encounter that much. On the contrary, we found they were so grateful that somebody was working to relate to everyday people and their everyday problems, right? But when we talked to party activists, those who were really active in party politics for a long time at the local or state level, we absolutely encountered that dynamic. And it's fascinating to me because, as the author said, you would think with that new information, they would update their beliefs about something. But on the contrary, they really did dig in and double down. And as I've spent so much time over the last several years thinking about this, I think so much of it is rooted in fear of loss. And I think this fear dynamic is part of, if not the majority of what's leading to greater and greater polarization in American politics. And I think so many elected officials and candidates respond to it on both sides by ridiculing and dismissing people's fears instead of taking a seat back and saying, talk to me about that.
Let's keep talking about New Way. So it's fascinating and brave that you tried to do this. How did you go about organizing the effort? What was the process?
It started with, a small group of us, maybe about 5 people initially, getting our heads around a table saying, what do we want to be? Do we want to be a Republican group that's fixing the Republican Party? Do we want to be a group of Republicans, independents, and Democrats that's working on just fixing political structures and dialogue and public discourse? So we've had many, many meetings trying to figure that out. And at least in our, first couple of years, we decided, let's try to fix the Republican Party. And then we went through this phase saying, okay, that's not really working. So can we bring, Democratic elected officials in with us who are like-minded in the need for improving public discourse, improving public policy making?
Well, Kristin, I guess the question is there any money out there? Is there enough money out there to fund efforts like that? There just don't seem to be a lot of centrist billionaires, if you will.
I do think the money is out there, and I think the interest is out there. Part of the challenge, I believe, is there's so many of these small Common Sense Party, New Way California, problem solvers efforts popping up all around the country. And organizing them to work together is really difficult. And I think the latest primaries illustrate that. We had a couple of people running as independents in high-profile races, one for governor, one for attorney general. And the attorney general candidate in particular raised quite a bit of money. But what we found on the ballot, she did not do well at all. And what we found is, even though I believe most voters are in this centrist place, they want to see leaders who aren't beholden to one political party or another. They want to see leaders who are going to do what's good for California, what's good for America, independent of their political stripes and party affiliations. But how do you get to know those people? Most people who are voting see names on a ballot, see a D or an R or no party preference next to them. And at least with the D or R, they have a general idea of what those people stand for. Whereas they see no party preference, and unless they've heard from that particular candidate, which again, most voters aren't going to be able to do in a nation state of 40 million people, they don't know what they stand for. So it's a safer bet to vote for what they know. And I think ultimately that's the challenge centrists are facing if they work outside of the party structures. Is it's extraordinarily difficult to reach people to such an extent that they know what you stand for and are willing to trust you with their vote.
We'll return to the episode in just a second, right after a quick update on what we're doing over in our premium feeds for The Purple Principle. Right now, if you join us on Patreon or Apple Podcast subscriptions, you'll hear a segment from our not-yet-released interview with Amy Chua coming out in July. Chua is the best-selling author of books like Political Tribes and Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother. She's thought a lot about why America is increasingly dividing into polarized and extreme camps, yet she remains optimistic about its enduring strengths.
We actually have an advantage that we do not have to pick between patriotism and having a really strong national identity and multiculturalism. We can actually have both. You could have thriving sub-identities and still a really strong American identity.
Bonus material from Amy Chua and other guests is available starting at $4.99 a month. And if you subscribe on Apple Podcasts now, you'll get a free week of premium Purple Principle content. So please subscribe and listen to the sneak peek, or is that a sneak listen, with Amy Chua by clicking the Patreon or Apple Podcasts link in the show notes. Now back to the episode. We've been speaking with former State Assembly Minority Leader Kristin Olsen. She was one of the founders of the New Way effort to form a distinct California GOP that failed to overcome our two-party mindset.
Yeah, there were some real branding challenges when they reached out to moderate Democrats and indies.
And our first California episode guest, Dan Schnur, he concurs with Kristin's comments there about the challenges for candidates running without major party backing.
I became the first independent, the first no-party preference candidate ever to run for statewide office in the state of California. And there were a few days when I thought I'd make history. But on most days, I thought the best I could do is maybe make it easier for the second no-party preference candidate to run for statewide office in California.
One thing I really appreciate about Dan Schnurr is he always keeps his sense of humor. And you can definitely say that about our next guest, Andrew Heaton. He's libertarian-leaning and a former congressional staffer. He calls himself one of the top 3 American comedians influenced by the economist Milton Friedman.
Besides those distinctions, Andrew Heaton is also the author of an unusual guidebook to your city, Barbara. It's called Los Angeles is Hideous: Poems About an Ugly City.
Andrew, I really would love to start with a quote from your book of poems, which I really enjoyed. And here's a good one for you. Los Angeles is a prison yard with sparklers chugging champagne beneath an overpass, a public toilet with a boob job, Instagram filters on a dead harlot. Andrew, really, I don't know why you hold back. You should tell us how you really
Well,
feel.
you know, a lot of people can't tell, but I actually am not a fan of Los Angeles. And I don't know if that came through in the poem. Barbara, can I tell you the funny thing about that? I've written several books, and I would imagine that probably everybody on your show's written a book, and you interview authors all the time. They're a lot of work. A funny coffee table book about Los Angeles took me 3 weeks and 60 milligrams of Adderall to write. And it was by far the most popular, successful book I've ever written, far more popular than novels that take years of blood and sweat to write. Instead, I wrote that. It got to #1 on poetry on Amazon, which I believe at this point means I am now a more successful poet than I am comedian or lover, which is not what I thought I would be doing at this point in my life, but I'll take it.
So that's LA. Does your just mild distaste extend to the whole state of California?
No, it doesn't. I do think I think there's lots of good and bad things about California. And the things that I don't like about California are largely pretty much zoning laws, to be honest with you. I am one of those dorks. And for your audience that doesn't know who I am, I used to work on Capitol Hill. I'm a think tank fellow. I'm also a comedian. I am in the unenviable position of being pretty funny, but not funny enough to make a full-time living at it. So I shifted into being a fairly comedic policy analyst. With California, I think the zoning laws are real bad in California. And I think they actually are directly related to why Los Angeles is so horrible, because there were all of these old racist laws that were put in place that forced the city to grow out rather than grow up. And I do take a lot of umbrage with that kind of thing. And I think that a significant amount of the serious housing issues in California are just the results of very poor systems at work that have not been fixed. But those are my big problems with it. I want to give shout out to California. California has open primaries, which I think is brilliant. I would love for more states to do that. I think that that would do quite a lot in terms of mitigating the polarization we're seeing right now. I would expand it to 4 or 5 top 5 in the open primary like Alaska. But all the same,
Rather than 2.
Exactly. But even then, like I'm from Oklahoma, right? Oklahoma is the holster of the Bible Belt. It's very, very conservative. So I know in Oklahoma that the Democrat is generally going to be a ornamental token character who's running against the person who won the Republican primary. The Republican primary is the real election that takes place in the state. Well, I'm not a Republican. I can't participate in that. So I would love the ability for the Republicans or the state as a whole to yield the top 2 candidates who are both going to be Republicans and at least let me pick between the two. That would be, we're in California, same thing.
And you put a lot of emphasis on communication. So how do you think California, the governor, the health department, the health commissioner, everyone, the media, what grades do you give them on how well they communicated the need for COVID measures and restrictions that some here in California, especially in Orange County, found so onerous?
So I don't know anything about the California Department of Health. I can't speak to that. I can speak to Governor Newsom a little bit. I was not impressed with him. I think during a pandemic, it's incredibly important that the people that are leading the charge need to have public trust. And that means that the government and the people that are running it need to be honest with you and forthright on that. I think that it is an extremely ineffective, if not morally heinous position to lie to people for their own good when it comes to a situation like that, because that undermines and erodes public trust. I mean, the really big one is the going to a donor dinner without a mask at a time when you were not supposed to go to restaurants at all. The interpretation I got was, well, I'm a smart guy and these laws don't really apply to me. They apply to the hoi polloi. The hoi polloi need to worry about masks and these things like that. But we, on our end, we're kind of exempt from this. And I thought that was a really bad thing for both his support and also just other people supporting his endeavors.
Yeah, well, Andrew, you talked a little bit about moving to Texas from California, and arguably Austin is not representative of the rest of Texas. But we're just curious, having lived in both places, do you hear Texans stereotyping or caricaturing Californians? And did you hear the opposite when you were there? Because there is this kind of cultural and economic rivalry between these two enormous states.
Well, I should say, Texas has a bone to pick with California specifically. You will see signs in Texas that say, "Don't California my Texas." That's a frequent political bumper sticker here, which occasionally you'll see on cars from Florida, which I find kind of odd. The number one demographic of people moving to Austin are other Texans. The second demographic of people moving to Austin is Florida, which you never hear anything about. And the third one is people from California. But nonetheless, the Texan ire tends to be for California. When I was in California, I should say I did not hear anything from California specifically geared towards Texas.
California doesn't think about Texas, Robert.
Right, exactly.
That just isn't a thing.
And I don't think the rest of the country thinks about Texas as much as Texas does. It's
100%.
When I lived in New York, I was amazed at the amount of rancor and naked, bitter condescension that was aimed at people from the South. But I will say that having now worked in political media for several years, I do not see any benefit at all to contempt. I have never seen contempt do anything to enlighten anybody, change their mind, turn down the emotions in the room, or lead to a positive result. And there is this contempt from Texas towards California. There is this contempt from the blue states towards the red states, and it's not helping. I'll add to this, the thing that surprised me culturally in California that I had not anticipated during the brief amount of time I was there was I would have a conversation with someone who was an overt Democrat who probably voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary and voted for Hillary Clinton back in the day. And multiple times I would have somebody look past me as if they were about to say something racist and then would go, "I think the wokeness has gone a little too far." And it felt, I was like, from my perspective, I'm like, we're in your Vatican. We're in Los Angeles. We're in your capital. You should feel very comfortable. Yeah. So why? That surprised me because you don't see that in Austin. People don't I think, actually we should wear masks. People are just a little bit more full-throated about whatever their opinions are.
Satirist and Milton Friedman fan, Andrew Heaton. And about that last point, Robert, I think it stands to reason that an ultra-liberal and trendy city like LA is going to provoke some backlash. I mean, the turmeric milk lattes in every cafe alone are way too woke for some people.
So maybe there's an episode to be done on polarizing lattes, Barbara? But for now, let's return to our conversation with Leon Panetta about some partisan trends he sees in young Californians attending the nonpartisan Panetta Institute for Public Policy. That's at Cal State Monterey Bay. We spoke with him about those interactions and his concerns for the future of California and the nation as we polarize and stereotype across the divide.
I tell the students here at the Panetta Institute that in a democracy, we govern either by leadership or by crisis. If leadership is there and willing to take the risks associated with leadership, then we can deal with crisis. We can control crisis. But if that leadership is not there, then we'll govern by crisis. And too often we govern by crisis. So what do we need? We need leaders who are willing to make tough decisions that are in the interest of the country. They have got to put the nation and the state ahead of party. That's the key. And yeah, are you going to offend people in your own party? You're damn right. But that's what leadership's all about.
Yeah, well, California is certainly not alone in having, what's called a trifecta, one-party control over all the chambers and mansions at one time. There's 37 of them in the U.S. right now, and that number could increase the next election. So what would be lost to state politics and national politics if all 50 states become trifectas?
Well, I'm afraid we're going to in the absence of leadership, I think that's what we're going to go through. We're going to go through a lot of parties breaking up. There'll be deep divisions within the states, and there'll be deep divisions within the country. And this polarization that we're experiencing today will only get worse. What's demanded here are leaders who are willing to provide a vision that reaches Americans, the average American, the average Californian. And that's what you have to keep in mind. I mean, who are the effective presidents? The presidents who were able to reach the average American. Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton was able to do that. And California's the same. Our best governors were governors who could reach the ordinary Californian with a vision as to where California needed to go.
But at the same time, there's a lot of young people, perhaps at the Panetta Institute, you're giving talks like this. There's a lot of young people who have seen no compromise in their lifetime, who just see two parties who are just constantly performative and have no interest in legislating.
You are absolutely right. And I've seen it in students. I mean, we have one course at the Panetta Institute where we bring law students down. And what I call it is I'm trying to teach them the art of governing. And I tell them, pick an issue, immigration, healthcare, the debt, whatever. And give me the Republican viewpoint, give me the Democratic viewpoint, and then tell me what a compromise would look like. And I've had students say to me, I don't want to look at the Republican viewpoint. And I said, no, that's not the way it works. You're going to have to give me the Republican viewpoint. You're going to have to give me the Democratic viewpoint, and then you're going to have to give me a consensus position. What would a compromise look like? And I said, you know what that is? That's called governing. That's how we govern. I mean, young people don't know what compromise is because they haven't had leadership that engages in that process of give and take. And so they always assume that it's all about causes, it's all about ideology, it's all about taking a particular position, then beating somebody over the head, rather than listening to one another and trying to work out the kind of solution that can solve the problems we face. We have a lot of work to do with our kids, with our students, in order to give them the tools they're going to need when they have to assume leadership in our democracy. And frankly, we're not providing a very good example right now, and that's what scares me the most.
Leon Panetta knows a thing or two about governance as a cabinet member, a White House chief of staff, and a 9-term California Congress member from what was then a fairly purplish district in a purplish state.
And he echoed there what our first California episode guest Joel Kotkin also observed in his 50 years living in and writing about the state.
When I came here in 1971, we had a two-party system. And within that two-party system, there were moderate and conservative factions. There was a great deal of debate. And we were usually able to find some sort of ability to make decent policy here in California based on some degree of rationality. In the last 20 to 30 years, and particularly in the last 10, the state has become essentially a one-party state.
But the recent California primaries could signal a bit of a shift. Some centrist candidates from both parties, many of them Latinos, they've made it to the general elections in November. Could they be able to draft and negotiate some legislation that more broadly addresses economic challenges in California? Inequality, affordability, homelessness. We'll be covering that in our Hispanic Swing Voter series this fall, featuring some exceptionally insightful Latino experts, such as recent Pulitzer Prize winner Maria Hinojosa.
But now I'd like to thank all of our California guests on this series for their insights into our nation's largest state. It's been a beacon for decades to young people, to immigrants, to entrepreneurs, although, according to many of our guests, the jury's out if it'll stay that way.
And certainly, Northern California has been the spawning ground of so much venture-funded tech innovation over the decades that has now been emulated around the U.S. and worldwide. Let's hope the Golden State can apply some of that innovative thinking to some very deep real-world issues.
Yes, but Robert, I'd really like to thank you and the Purple Principle team for having me on this series. It's been such a pleasure.
Oh, please, Barbara, all thanks to you. But we're not done with you yet. So much more came out of that interview with Andrew Heaton.
Oh man, yes, you could say that again. I guess he certainly deserves his own episode, which is what he'll get. It'll drop in July when the Purple Principle celebrates Independence Day for the whole month.
I am an independent. I am ethnically a Republican because I'm from Oklahoma, but I worked on the Hill as a Democrat. I got really into libertarian stuff for a while. I still have leanings that are that way, but I am an independent. I'd say I am a temperamental moderate who wants to help people but thinks the government's not very effective at it.
And we're also observing Independence Day month with the refreshingly unpredictable Amy Chua. She's next up on the Purple Principle, possibly best known as Tiger Mom for that provocative bestseller. But Professor Chua's more recent book, Political Tribes, that's truly one of the best explorations of political polarization ever written.
You know, I said in Political Tribes that we actually had an advantage, that we do not have to pick between, patriotism and having a really strong national identity and multiculturalism. We can actually have both. You can have thriving sub-identities and still a really strong American identity. And I think, in some ways, both prongs are being challenged right now.
We really hope you'll join us for these episodes and support us on Patreon or Apple subscriptions as we develop more state-focused episodes and produce our series on Hispanic swing voters. Thanks for listening from the entire Purple Principle team. All music composed and created by Ryan Adair Rooney. The Purple Principle is a Fluent Knowledge production.